She'd been with my grandmother for 3 years before I found the first bond certificate tucked inside a library book. Not hidden, exactly, more like forgotten. Or maybe she assumed no one in the family read anymore. The book was a dog-eared copy of something by Agatha Christie, which, now that I think about it, is almost too on the nose, and the certificate was folded in thirds, pressed flat between chapters 11 and 12. A Series EE savings bond. Issued 1987. My grandmother's name across the top in that old government typeface. Face value, $4,000. I stood in the dining room for a moment, just holding it. The house smelled like the lavender oil my grandmother kept near the stove, and the refrigerator hummed. Normal sounds. Normal afternoon. But something in my chest had already shifted. That was a Tuesday in March. By Friday, I'd found 9 more. Different denominations, different issue years, all tucked into books, shoved behind picture frames, slid under drawer liners. And then, in a coffee tin, on the highest kitchen shelf, the one my grandmother physically couldn't reach, without a step stool, I found a handwritten inventory, my grandmother's handwriting. Old and shaky, but still precise. 43 bonds listed. Total estimated value at maturity, $210,000. I counted what I had in front of me. 11. I put everything back exactly where I found it. This is the part people don't understand when I tell this story. Why I didn't call the police that Friday. Why I didn't call my mother. Why I went home, made dinner, and didn't say a single word to anyone for almost 2 weeks. People want to hear that you exploded, that you screamed, that you confronted someone in a kitchen doorway and watched them crumble. That's not how I'm built. And honestly, looking back, if I had done that, if I'd let panic run the play, I would have lost. I would have looked like the hysterical granddaughter making accusations against a licensed caretaker with a spotless 3-year record and references from 2 other families. I had 11 bonds and a coffee tin. She had a clean background check and my grandmother's complete trust. So I did something harder. I kept showing up. Her name was Renata. She was in her late 50s, originally from the Philippines, and she was genuinely good at her job. That's the part that still sits with me. She wasn't some monster who neglected my grandmother. She cooked for her. She knew her medication schedule cold. She'd sit with her and watch old game show reruns for hours without complaint. My grandmother adored her. Genuinely, called her my Renata like she was family. That's what made the whole thing so precise. Renata hadn't stumbled into an opportunity she'd cultivated over 3 years, with patience and warmth and real human care. And then she'd leveraged it. The week after I found the tin, I started tracking the visits differently. I'd always come by on Sundays, I added Wednesday evenings. I started arriving a little earlier than announced. Not suspicious. Just a daughter-in-law being attentive. I brought food. I sat at the kitchen table. I watched. Renata had a canvas tote she kept near the back door. It was a mundane thing, the kind you get free at a grocery store, printed with a fruit stand logo. She'd bring it in each morning with her lunch and her reading glasses and a paperback. She'd leave with it each evening. I'd never thought twice about it. Now I couldn't stop thinking about it. My husband Marcus had been watching me process this for 2 weeks by the time I finally told him what I'd found. He's not an emotional reactor either, which is one of the reasons we work. He sat across from me at our kitchen table, listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said, "Okay, we need to know the scope before we do anything." He was right. 11 bonds confirmed missing. 32 unaccounted for, either still in the house somewhere or already gone. We had no way to know when the removal had started or how she'd been cashing them. Bonds like that, older Series EE certificates, you can redeem at certain bank branches with a valid ID. She could have been doing it for a year, 2 years. Marcus made one phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not yet. To a private investigator he'd worked with 3 years earlier on a commercial real estate dispute. Someone methodical. Someone quiet. His name was Gerald, and he was the least theatrical person I've ever met, which is exactly why I trusted him immediately. Gerald laid it out plainly. We needed to establish a pattern of removal, document the method of transportation, and ideally capture a redemption transaction on record. He said in his experience, confrontation without documentation ends in a civil dispute that drags on for years. Documentation with confrontation ends it. I want to be honest about the next 6 weeks, because they were genuinely strange to live through. Knowing something that large, a number like $210,000. A betrayal that intimate, and then walking into my grandmother's house twice a week and pouring Renata a cup of coffee and asking how Grandma's knee was doing. Sitting in the living room, nodding. The fluorescent light above the kitchen sink had a flicker I'd never paid attention to before. I noticed it on every visit after. The way it would pulse slightly, every 4 or 5 minutes, barely perceptible. I'd stare at it while Renata talked, just to have something to anchor me. I started finding the remaining bonds. Slowly, 1 or 2 per visit when I had a window alone. I photographed each one with my phone, noted the denomination and serial number in a spreadsheet Marcus had set up, and replaced them exactly. My grandmother had no idea. She'd watch her game shows in the other room, and I'd work quickly and quietly, and some part of me kept thinking, she worked her whole life for this money. She budgeted and saved and sacrificed, and she trusted someone completely, and that person saw it as a resource. Here's what I want to ask you genuinely, not rhetorically. If you found out someone had been slowly removing assets from an elderly person in your family over months or years, and you had the chance to either call the police immediately and risk a premature confrontation that might not hold up or wait, build an airtight case, and let them walk into a trap of their own making, which would you do? Drop it in the comments, because I've had people tell me I was wrong to wait. I've had people tell me waiting was the only thing that made justice actually happen. I don't know that there's a clean answer. What I know is what Gerald captured on the 4th week. Renata left my grandmother's house at 5:47 p.m. on a Thursday with the canvas tote. Gerald had been sitting in a parked car down the block for 9 days of rotating surveillance. He followed her to a credit union 2 miles away. She went in. She was inside for 11 minutes. She came out without the tote. He had footage of her entering with it and exiting without it. The following Tuesday, he obtained the redemption records through methods that are entirely legal and that I'll leave vague because it's not the point. 3 bonds. Redeemed that Thursday. Combined value, just over $8,000. Her signature on the redemption forms. 3 bonds. $8,000. Her signature. I sat with that report for a long time. Not because I was surprised I'd known in my bones since the coffee tin, but there's a difference between knowing something and having it documented on paper with a timestamp and a transaction number. One is instinct. The other is evidence. And evidence, Gerald had told us from the beginning, is the only thing that ends this cleanly. Marcus and I talked until past midnight that night. Not about what to do that part, we both already knew. We talked about my grandmother, about how to tell her, about whether to tell her at all before we had to. She was 81 years old, physically fragile but sharper than people gave her credit for. She'd built those bonds over decades' birthday money, tax refunds, small deliberate deposits into a savings instrument she trusted, because her own mother had used them. They weren't an investment strategy. They were a philosophy, slow accumulation, patience as a form of love. And Renata had understood that completely. Had sat with her, listened to her talk about them, watched her open that coffee tin probably a dozen times, had learned the inventory, had made herself indispensable, and then had started quietly dismantling what took a lifetime to build. I want you to hear me clearly on this. I do not use the word evil loosely. But I'm not sure what other word applies to someone who studies a person's trust that carefully and then harvests it. We brought Gerald's documentation to an elder law attorney. First, her name was Patricia Suin, and she specialized in exactly this kind of case, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She told us, without blinking, that what we had was strong. The footage, the redemption records, the signature match, the handwritten inventory establishing my grandmother's ownership it was the kind of evidentiary package that prosecutors actually want to work with. She made one phone call while we sat in her office, to an investigator she knew at the county district attorney's office. Renata was still showing up every morning. That's the detail that will always feel surreal to me. For the 2 weeks it took to coordinate between Patricia Suin, the Dawes investigator, and local law enforcement, 2 full weeks, Renata was still arriving at my grandmother's house at 8 in the morning, still cooking her breakfast, still sitting with her through the afternoon game shows, still carrying that canvas tote in and out. Marcus and I had agreed with the attorneys that we couldn't tip our hand. Any deviation from routine could spook her, and if she stopped showing up, if she destroyed records or moved money, the case got harder. So we let it run. I went to my grandmother's house 4 times during those 2 weeks. I sat at the kitchen table across from Renata, and I drank coffee and I talked about the weather. I watched her hands when she moved around the kitchen. I watched how she spoke to my grandmother, still gentle, still attentive, still real, in a way that genuinely complicated my anger. Because that's the part I couldn't resolve then, and still can't fully resolve now, the care was real. The theft was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and I didn't have a framework for that. My grandmother asked me once, during one of those visits, if something was wrong. She was watching me from her armchair, and her eyes were very clear and very direct, and I thought, not for the first time, that she saw more than she let on. I told her no. I said I was just tired from work. She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and then nodded, and turned back to the television. I don't know if she believed me. I think she might have known something was happening and chosen, for her own reasons, not to push. She was good at that too. Patience runs in the family, apparently. The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. We weren't there. The attorneys had advised against it strongly, and they were right. Renata was taken into custody at my grandmother's home, which I'll acknowledge was not the most dignified way to handle it, but it was the way that preserved the evidence trail. Law enforcement executed a search of her vehicle and her residence that same day. In her car, in a zippered pouch inside a larger bag, they found 11 additional bond certificates. In her home, in a fireproof lockbox under her bed, they found documentation of 22 bonds she'd already redeemed over the previous 19 months. 19 months. She'd been doing this since nearly the beginning. The full scope came to 33 bonds. The 11 in her car recovered intact. The 22 already liquidated. Combined redemption value of the cashed bonds, just under $140,000. The remaining bonds in my grandmother's home, the ones I'd been quietly photographing for weeks, were secured and catalogued that same day. Total loss, before recovery efforts, $139,400. Patricia Sewin moved immediately on civil asset recovery in parallel with the criminal case. Renata had not spent it all. Some portion was in accounts that could be frozen, and some had been sent to family members overseas, which complicated things considerably, but didn't make them impossible. The criminal case moved more directly. Renata was charged with felony elder financial abuse, grand theft, and forgery. The redemption forms required her to certify that she was the named owner of the bonds, which she demonstrably was not. She pled guilty 8 months later, sentenced to 4 years, eligible for parole after 2. Ordered to pay full restitution, which in practice means the civil recovery proceedings do the actual work of getting money back. And it's slow, and it's incomplete, but it's something. Now my grandmother. I've thought about how to tell this part more than any other part of this story, because it's the part that doesn't resolve cleanly. We told her the afternoon of the arrest. Marcus and I sat with her in her living room, the lavender oil smell, the refrigerator hum, all of it the same as the day I found that first bond in the Agatha Christie novel, and we told her everything. From the coffee tin, from the bonds I'd found and photographed, from Gerald and the credit union footage. All of it. She listened without interrupting. She's always been a good listener. When we finished, she was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "I knew she needed money. She never asked me. That's all she said. Not that she felt betrayed, though she must have. Not that she was angry, though she had every right to be. Just I knew she needed money. She never asked me." I've turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count. Whether it was grief, or wisdom, or simply the particular mercy that comes from being 81 years old and having seen enough of the world to understand that people do terrible things for reasons that don't excuse the terrible things. I don't know. I've stopped trying to interpret it and started just holding it. She never asked to see the criminal case updates. She never asked about the restitution proceedings. She asked once, about 3 months later, whether Renata was all right. I told her she was in custody, and she nodded and didn't ask again. What she did ask for, 2 weeks after the arrest, was help finding a new caretaker. She was practical about it in a way that broke my heart a little. She had a list of questions she'd written out herself, in that same old, careful handwriting. Things she wanted to know about anyone new before they came into her house. I still have a photograph of that list on my phone, right next to the photographs of the bond certificates. She didn't stop trusting people. I want you to know that. She was more careful, yes, but she didn't close. And I think that took more courage than anything I did in those 6 months of building the case. I was tactical. I was methodical. I had the luxury of anger to keep me moving. She just had to keep living in the house where it happened and decide, at 81, whether the world was still worth opening up to. She decided it was. If you've made it to the end of this, if this story hit something for you, if you have an elderly person in your life whose finances nobody's really watching, or if you just needed to hear that patience and documentation actually work, I want you to know the comments are open, and I read every single one. People share things in the comments on these videos that remind me why I started telling these stories in the first place. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because there are more stories, and none of them are simple. And that's exactly the point.